there's a way in which anti-rights actors or anti-rights movements communicate. They don't often attack women's rights clearly or in a way that is easy to discern. A lot of the time when they are attacking women's rights or human rights more broadly, they will use narratives and they will say things like, we're actually trying to protect the family, or we're trying to protect children. And in many instances on the continent, we're also seeing them say that they're trying to protect African values, which include tradition, which include religion, but they're also saying things like we're trying to fight foreign ideologies being imported to the continent.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Africa for Dummies podcast, the A4D podcast, where we break down African politics, history, and culture, as well as current affairs in the ways that make sense to you. I am your host, as usual, Zenge. What is unusual is that my co-host Nathan, will not be making it today. But we actually have two very special guests, of which one will be actually co-piloting this episode. So this is a special for International Women's Day, where we will be highlighting the vital role that women are playing in shaping human rights, justice, social change, political, economic change across the continent of Africa. I am very excited, first of all, to introduce Sibusisiwe Ndlela, a human rights lawyer with over 8 years of experience in strategic litigation, legal research, and advocacy across Africa. She's the managing lawyer for the Countering Anti-Rights Actors thematic area at the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, leading legal strategies to challenge anti-rights movements that threaten gender equality, sexual and reproductive health rights, and broader human rights protections. Welcome to the podcast, Sibusisiwe. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Hi, Zenge. Thank you so much. You did pronounce my name correctly. Thanks.
Excellent. It's always good to know that you got it correct. So then we also have Maram Mahdi, who is going to be co-piloting this episode with me today. So we're switching things up a bit. She's a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, ISLA, and a scholar of human rights, bringing her expertise on security, governance, and human rights issues across the continent. Welcome to the podcast, Maram.
Thank you, Zenge. Glad to be your co-host for today.
Sure, yeah. So why don't you lead the way with the first questions then?
Okay, so women taking it over. No, thanks very much, Zenge, and thanks to Sibusisiwe again for joining us this evening. Just start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself. What do you do? Just in general, a little bit more about your organization and background.
Thanks, Maram. I'm so glad to see that women are taking the lead. Right now, I work at the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, which is a Pan-African and feminist organization that uses, among other things, the law as a tool for social change. We have a number of broad thematic areas that include violence against women, women's socioeconomic rights, and countering anti-rights actors, which we call CARA. And that's what we're going to be delving quite deep into today. So essentially in CARA, we focus on resisting the anti-rights movement on the continent. And this is born out of the recognition that anti-rights movements are increasingly becoming more coordinated and more intentional in how they engage in the African regional human rights system. And they essentially pose a systemic threat because they seek to drive regressive agendas that seek to undermine women's human rights and human rights more broadly, as well as legal institutions and even democracy. So at ISLA, we have a number of different ways of working, which we call priority areas. And just roughly, the first one is building partnerships for social change, which houses our feminist litigation network, which is our pool of network lawyers, which we train and which we engage when we litigate strategically across the continent. That also houses our collaborations across the organization. Another priority area we have is producing knowledge for social change, which houses our work on research and publications. Then we have a priority area called strengthening capacity to litigate strategically, which focuses more on capacity strengthening. And then last but not least, we have litigation for social change, which is the strategic litigation arm of the organization. And that is where I'm based. And for the most part, we are using strategic litigation to oppose the lawfare that is posed by anti-rights actors. So broadly, when I say lawfare, I'm talking about the strategic weaponization of the law to drive ulterior motives. So yeah, that's a bit about me, a bit about Islam.
So yeah, no, thanks for that, Sibusi. I think it's great, but to maybe pick up on that last point that you touched on, in terms of lawfare, and I think some of the legislation that is in place. So maybe if you can speak a little bit more about what actually is the anti-rights movement. I mean, it's not a term that I think a lot of people know and are very familiar with. So what is the anti-rights movement with respect to women?
You're right. It is a term that isn't really employed in common speak and probably not in podcasts as well. But when we talk about the anti-rights movement, we're talking about networks of different types of actors that include individuals, organizations, and even sometimes state actors who work to roll back on human rights standards and democratic principles more broadly. So what they do is they target different human rights and they also target different issues. So just by way of illustration, because we are talking about women, some of the issues that they target more intensely or disproportionately are issues around sexuality and gender, which would obviously include women's rights issues. Prominent women's rights issues include things like access to abortion, access to contraception, and of course, gender-based violence. But we're also seeing them creep, of course, into the private sphere, including through family law. So when people say anti-rights, I usually refer to the term anti-rights more broadly, but some people prefer to use the term anti-gender movements to foreground the fact that the particular type of anti-rights movement that they're dealing with is one that focuses disproportionately on sexuality and gender. So there's a way in which anti-rights actors or anti-rights movements communicate. They don't often attack women's rights clearly or in a way that is easy to discern. A lot of the time when they are attacking women's rights or human rights more broadly, they will use narratives and they will say things like, we're actually trying to protect the family or we're trying to protect children. And in many instances on the continent, we're also seeing them say that they're trying to protect African values, which include tradition, which include religion. But they're also saying things like we're trying to fight foreign ideologies being imported to the continent. So they don't often state their case in express terms. They use these narratives to reframe some of the human rights that we want to protect as being threats to society. But when you actually look at what is happening, they're using these emotive topics or emotive issues as a front to basically regress on some of the human rights protections that largely apply to women.
I'm actually very. I was gonna actually ask how this is like being propelled, like what tools are used to promote the anti-rights phenomenon, and you've sort of already gone into the fact that they circle around narratives like family planning and even African values, which is very interesting. And I'm just curious about the. I guess maybe you can define a bit more in terms of how this looks practically. So if there's a girl going to seek abortion, the fact that we're even talking about abortion is very unorthodox because in many other countries, just even the mention of it is somewhat taboo. But I think maybe, for example, in Zambia, maybe the issue would be abortion, and in Somalia or the Gambia, I know there's lots of FGM, female genital mutilation things going on. And actually, there was an Obama leader I was with 2 years ago or last year, and she was actually talking about it. And it seems to have been a very big sort of social movement fighting against it, and the same things that you're saying about African values and African sort of norms being the one that is being protected vis-a-vis what would otherwise be seen as something that is an affront to women's rights. So how does that look like in terms of like a practical case? How would that how would an anti-rights movement successfully curtail women's rights in a practical sort of case that you might know of?
Okay. That's actually a very good question. And I think it's always useful to use concrete examples so that people can understand, because I know it can get very, very abstract. So I'm glad you, Zenge, referred to FGM in the Gambia in particular. So let me take a few steps back. So a few years ago in the Gambia, they introduced a piece of legislation that was aimed at criminalizing FGM. So this was a piece of legislation that was introduced in recognition of the fact that FGM constitutes a harmful practice. It constitutes a form of violence against women, and it overall is a violation of women's rights. Great. We have progressive legislation that is affirming a human rights standard that is applied internationally and also on the continent. So subsequent to that, there has been a court case, or there is a court case that is currently pending before the Supreme Court in the Gambia. And this case is about challenging that specific piece of legislation that was introduced. So what you're seeing in that case is anti-rights rhetoric. So when I say that, what I mean is the petitioners in that case argue that, among other things, this piece of legislation that was aimed at criminalizing FGM is actually violating women's rights. And they specifically point to women's right to religion as well as their right to culture. So these two things are being counterweighed against each other. And I'm going to probably speak about this a bit more later, but that's a distortion of the law, because the underlying purpose of what the law on FGM is about, which is to protect women and to protect their rights, the law and human rights are now being used as a basis to render this piece of legislation unconstitutional. So that type of rhetoric, which is very alarming, because they are using the same language that we use. They're using human rights. They're using consent. They're using autonomy, and they're using things that we have used as the women's rights movement to fight for our own rights and to gain some of these hard-fought wins that are allowing us to improve our lives. So that's one of the ways in which anti-rights actors will step, or anti-rights rhetoric creeps into the law and is weaponized against women to undermine their rights.
And I mean, I think maybe to pick up on that, and hopefully not to get you in too much trouble, but you know, who are actually some of these actors, right? We want to talk about things in terms of concrete examples, but who are these actors? How do they push these narratives? Is it through social media? Is it through legislation? Is it through other digital spaces? And so how really are these narratives, how do they come out, essentially? I know particularly in the case of the Gambia, which is really an excellent example. I know that there was a case a couple of years back where there were women who were on trial for, cutting a baby, if I'm not mistaken. And in that particular case, there was actually a member of parliament who was also an imam, I think, who actually ended up paying for these sets of women, who actually ended up paying their trial fees and so on. And it was just to show that, definitely in those kind of cases, you actually have members of parliament, religious leaders and so on, that are quite influential in pushing the anti-rights movement.
I'm glad you've hopped onto that example, because it's quite a live issue, but it's also quite emotive. But what you often see is there are a broad range of people who can become anti-rights actors, some intentionally so, some unintentionally, but they can employ this rhetoric in a way that is harmful, in a way that undermines women's rights. So the thing about these narratives is the ones about family, the ones about children, about African values, is these are very easy things to latch onto. A lot of people can be in support of the family. Who doesn't want to support the family? A lot of people can be, especially in the age of decolonialism, we're all trying to fight foreign imports. So when you say we're fighting for African values, it's easy to latch onto that. So it becomes something that becomes an issue that can mobilize people. So a lot of different actors exist on the continent, but what we're seeing is there are much larger transnational actors who are pulling the strings. They are the ones who are funding campaigns. They are the ones who are organizing these conferences across the continent, conferences that are aimed at bringing together parliamentarians, that are aimed at bringing together other political actors in the system. And what they're doing is they might even be sharing proposed bills about how can we protect the family in your jurisdiction. Here's a piece of draft legislation that you could be advancing in your jurisdiction to protect the family. So there are different ways in which they engage. We've spoken a bit about organizing online as well. There are big campaigns that are existing online. They talk about disinformation. They spread this message far and wide. So there isn't a single way in which they organize. They speak to traditional leaders. They speak to religious leaders. They speak to parents. They speak to teachers. They potentially can be mobilizing any number of actors who can be in support of some of the messages, because they've been very successful at bringing down these narratives to the person on the street and getting them to mobilize around them. But I think what's more important, for me at least, is these larger actors, these transnational ones. Those are the very dangerous ones that I believe are taking precedence from one place and transplanting it to another. They are the ones who are now taking initiatives on a regional level. They're not just being restricted to particular domestic jurisdictions. They're organizing regional conferences, bringing together judges, bringing together all of these different people who are quite important in the process of interpreting or even passing legislation as well, interpreting the law or passing legislation. So those big actors are the people that I think are quite problematic.
I think you've sort of given us I actually didn't know the transnational aspect of it. What I wouldn't be surprised by is sort of the right-wing movements, particularly the influence of different pressure groups. And it's not always right-wing movements. It's just those who are maybe conservative, religious pressure groups that finance or remove financing from things like Planned Parenthood or certain access to certain sort of health or reproductive rights. And that was talked about a lot with the sort of the coming in of Trump or even previous conservative governments. How does that because the question that I'm trying to get into is the Roe versus Wade one, but I think Maram can explain that a bit in more detail. But I'm a bit curious about the external involvement and how like politics from other countries affect and are transplanted to politics in Africa.
Perhaps before we get to you, Maram, sorry to interrupt. So we all exist in a global context. So a lot of the advancements that are happening across the world, the trends that we're seeing across the world, we are not really immune to them. So what you're also seeing with the anti-rights movement is their advancements and their strategies are aligned to much broader political shifts that we're seeing in political systems and international law and the like. So what we're seeing is there's clear backsliding when it comes to democracy. More and more people are living under repressive regimes. There's a rise in authoritarianism and far-right movements, as you mentioned, Zenge, and they are part of the people and the groups of people who are embracing conservative ideologies. And we're also seeing things like anti-migrant groups. That, for me, is also very much a part of this much broader question of sovereignty, of nationalism, and more importantly, also with what is happening with the Middle East and the US and Israel. There are significant attacks to multilateralism more broadly, and we're seeing even international law, which has its established rules and principles, we're seeing that being undermined quite consistently. So these are things that contribute towards the things that we're seeing happening on the continent. It's making it easier for us to undermine some of the progress that we're seeing, or these are things that are all related. It's not separate. These feed into each other.
I mean, absolutely. I think to pick up on that last point, it's really about the intersectionality of it all, right? Like you mentioned, the sort of the authoritarian regimes that are growing in Africa, the backsliding of democracy, it's all mixed to the impact that this has on women. And so the anti-rights movement seems to have gained a lot of prominence, right? And I'm just wondering also a little bit why that is. I mean, beyond sort of the influence of other sort of democratic backsliding or so on, is there like a specific piece of legislation incident that we can really pick up on and say, okay, this is the reason as to why we seem to be backsliding in terms of women's empowerment, women's education, progress, and so on. I'm not sure if there's like a particular event or moment. I know it's a tough question, but really, what's the reason as to why this movement has made so much ground in the last couple of years?
So I don't think there is any one moment or any one thing. The closest, in my opinion, would be the fact that as the women's rights movement, as the human rights movement more broadly, we've had major successes in a number of different ways. And the specific ways in which we advocate and we advance our claims have been successful in different quarters of the world. So this organizing and this need to retain a hold on power and consolidate power is in direct response to the fact that we are seeking to shift the power from one direction to the other. And so this response is aimed at getting things back to things that are, or getting the power back, basically. So I think that is the closest thing that I can think of as the one component that could be contributing towards this. But I mean, the broader global and political shifts are, in my opinion, the biggest contributor to why we're seeing anti-rights actors organizing in particular.
And so maybe taking it back to Roe versus Wade, I mean, do you think that was sort of like a positive impact or a negative impact? Or more broadly, like what influence did it really have in Africa? I mean, if you see, a country like the US who has made so much strides over its, 500, 600 year history, in terms of women's rights, now backsliding, what does that mean for us in Africa?
Because the legal systems are very separate, there isn't a direct legal effect for the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And that judgment of the Supreme Court of the US, which is Dobbs v. Jackson, I don't think it has that much direct legal import. What we're rather seeing is that becomes precedent that is used as a form of comparative law for movements or people with similar views to advance claims to challenge constitutional rights. So, in my opinion, the biggest implication that the overturning of Roe v. Wade has is it has emboldened anti-rights actors. It has demonstrated to them that if you can litigate strategically, you can achieve gains even on laws or judgments that are 50 years old, that are settled. You can reverse that provided you take this battle to the courts. You systematically seek to use the law to drive some of the change that you're seeking to see. So that for me was probably the biggest contributor that the overturning of Roe v. Wade has had. And more people are using strategic litigation. They're recognizing that the law can be their weapon, the weapon to oppress. They're also recognizing that courts can become their battleground where they can advance the type of arguments or create the world that they want to see, essentially.
So now I'm thinking, how do we change the narrative, right? Like, how is this being countered? What are the possible methods that could be utilized, that we have in Africa, essentially, where maybe I'm also thinking that, to get to the same level of organizing to push back and push against the anti-rights movement. So really, what are the forms that countering these narratives is taking?
So there are a number of different ways in which anti-rights movements can be, and anti-rights rhetoric can be countered. And it can be discursive in the sense that we're challenging these narratives as they exist in the public domain. They can be legal in a sense that we're challenging the types of lawfare that they're seeking to advance to regress human rights. So the answer basically lies in whichever forum that we seek to engage. But essentially, anti-rights movements pose quite a systemic threat to the human rights system and democracy as we currently understand it. And so any form of resistance that we seek to put up needs to be coordinated. We need to know exactly how these anti-rights movements are operating. We need to know what tactics they apply. We also need to engage in more cross-movement type of work. This isn't a women's rights issue. And I mentioned earlier that that's why we prefer to use the term anti-rights, because this isn't just going to be about anti-gender, or this isn't just about sexuality and gender, rather. It's much broader. This has implications that can affect climate justice, which one wouldn't ordinarily think. But this is a systemic threat. It is a threat to all types of human rights that exist. This isn't just a threat to women's rights. It's not just a threat to queer people's rights. It's a threat to all of our human rights, because what these people and what these actors do is they want to hollow out the content of a human right. You will think we're talking about abortion here only. I know Zenge smart a bit when I said abortion earlier, but it's not always just about abortion. It's about bodily autonomy. It's about talking about what one can do with their body. It's not just about, is the person a woman? Is it a queer person? It's all of our bodies, because it's going to affect all of our rights. So sometimes we tend to focus on the rights holder. Is it a queer person? Is it a woman? But we must focus on the right, because the right is one that is universally applicable to all of us. So that's something that I think is really, really important. But I just want to take a moment to talk about, I think, something that might be lesser known. I know we spoke about it a bit earlier about how exactly anti-rights actors engage the law. But the example that I made earlier about FGM was about how anti-rights actors distort the law. But in addition to distorting the law, they can also engage in lawfare, which is where they weaponize the law for ulterior motives. And this can include things like slap suits, where they seek to silence dissenting voices. They can seek to deplete people's resources. They can gag people from speaking out. So it is something that is quite opportunistic and strategic in the way that they use the law to undermine rights more broadly.
I was at like a early childhood marriage event. Apparently, Zambia is a champion for early childhood marriage. So I wanted to give an example. And
Please,
yeah,
maybe go ahead. But I must say, I'm not always the best authority on all of these things because it's quite intersectional. Sometimes it can be about violence. Sometimes it can be about something else. But maybe pose the question and then I can see if I can answer it.
yeah. Okay. So no, I went to this launch for an early childhood marriage report. Zambia happens to be the AU champion for ending child marriage in Africa. And apparently there's a lot of legal loopholes all over Africa when it comes to ages. And something here said more than half of the girls in Sahel have at least, some people have at least attempted to marry them under the age of 18. But here's the story I wanted to say. It's very short, really. There was a family friend of ours from the eastern, and it's very prevalent in eastern Zambia, the eastern province. There's a family friend of ours, and he was in it's like somewhere in his village area, and they were marrying off a girl that was like 12 or 13, and he came and obviously he lives in Lusaka and he was just visiting the rural areas. And he came and intervened and said, hey, this is wrong. What are you guys doing? This is insane. A small girl, basically underage, marrying a pretty older guy. And they basically rejected him and said, why don't you have your own kids? And you go get married. You go marry your own kids. These are my kids and you shouldn't be interfering in my personal family affairs, basically. And so it's very prevalent that side. And to them, it's a very simple argument that, hey, these are, so I think my question really was, how do you approach people in these African settings? Obviously you can speak from your own, experience, not everywhere in Africa, because the different challenges, different sort of perceptions, because how do you approach people like this who literally just say, hey, this is my kid, why are you? Because it sounds very like a very hard thing to approach when it comes to countering these type of acts. And I think, and you also said it's a human rights type of thing. And I know some people, obviously, if it's a girl talking to them about women's rights versus a guy talking to them about women's rights, there'll be very different sort of outcomes. And I meant, during the thing, sorry for mentioning it, I've mentioned it a couple of times, during the Obama leadership thing, he was talking about activism and the difference between talking to, let's say, a boomer, a very, like, a guy in his maybe 60s or so, about, like, let's say, women's rights, and maybe talking to him on the terms of like his daughter or someone he's close to facing the same challenge. The sort of response is a bit different. So I'm curious about, how do you approach this in the African setting? How do you make ordinary people, like in the rural area, like that guy, understand that, hey, this is not necessarily the right way to do things? Because he just saw it as a simple get out of my business type of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I think the way in which to approach this is through narrative change, I would believe. But the first thing I must say is, this is a caveat. This is not my area of expertise in terms of how to specifically directly respond to social issues and social resistance to changing cultural practices. A lot of the time we focus more on the law, but we exist in an ecosystem where there are people who are responsible for narrative change, which is what I believe you're partially speaking to. And the biggest thing, as you had already intimated towards, is you need to recognize your audience. You need to recognize what their interests are. You need to recognize that this is a practice. It's a long-standing practice. This is the way that things have been done historically. And people don't often have the same ideas about what should and shouldn't happen. So in the course of engaging in this narrative change work, one would need to investigate what type of arguments can be advanced to a person like that. And are we also capable of changing people's minds? So for the most part, we work more with the law. And this is quite an interesting fact that I want to share with you. I'm glad you went to an event on early childhood marriage, but in February of last year, the AU introduced this convention called the Convention on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. And since you mentioned early childhood marriage, do you know that there is no reference in that convention to early childhood marriage? There is no reference to marital rape. These are recognized forms of violence against women. Why would you omit something that is practiced in so many jurisdictions on the continent and proclaim that this is a landmark convention that is meant to be advancing the rights of women and girls on the continent and is meant to be protecting them from violence? It's important for us to name these things, and in recognition of some of the substantive and even procedural gaps that exist in this convention, we have embarked on a campaign with other individuals, organizations, just to talk about these gaps and to critically analyze this convention. And we even launched a campaign called #NotFitForPurpose to talk about these substantive gaps. And I'm happy to share a link to that campaign or to that page, just so that people can read more about what we're talking about when we say some of the normative content of rights is missing or is being hollowed out. So, yeah, happy to share the link to that campaign.
No, but I really like that you picked up on that. And maybe an anecdote from my side as well is that, I come from a country, so I'm originally from Sudan, right? And I have aunts, cousins who have been married at the age of 14. I think both of my grandmothers actually were married at the age of 14, and in some cases actually even before they got their menstrual cycle. So very much in so many biological senses, and I think in so many different ways, really children. It's not just a question of age in terms of whether they're 18 or not, but also in the pure fact that they were purely children. So it's something that's very prevalent, and I think to hear that the African Union policy that you referred to, it doesn't make reference to early marriage or forced marriage or even honor marriages, which really take place in a lot of the North African countries that also tend to be Islamic, and it's part of what is our Sharia law. I mean, that's something that I think is really a big gap. Yeah, Zenge.
Could you define what exactly are honor marriages for those that are initiated?
So basically, it's if a family finds out that their child, that their girl child, has either been raped or in some cases has practiced sex, premarital sex of her own decision of volition. In that case, they force her to marry her victim. Her perpetrator. In that case, or if she did it also of her own accord, it's then the same thing of, you decided to do adult things with that understanding. So this is the person that you now will be with for life. And so that's quite common actually in the context of the ongoing war in Sudan. It's happened, quite often where, I don't have the stats on it, but it's become quite prevalent, where, there's been a lot of sexual abuse and violence and rape. And unfortunately, the women that get raped actually end up having to marry their perpetrators. So it's really quite shocking. It's horrendous, but there's very few protection mechanisms, particularly in the case of Sudan, like I'm talking about now. There's very few protection mechanisms, which is really sad. But yeah, I think the AU policy, I think it's great to see that you're doing this work to see how it can actually be revised, and that more protections and legislation can actually, and policies can actually look at this a little bit more. But there's also another piece of legislation that I actually was interested in. And that is let me make sure that I'm getting it right. But I think the AU is also introducing something that's titled, it's a proposed policy on African Charter of Family Sovereignty and Values. And I mean, how do you think that is going to be framed? Is it, sticking similarly to the same African values and traditions? Or is it going to be more progressive in terms of how it defines what are African values and family, essentially?
The AU, it's the AU convention. So it's not actually even a policy. It's a regional convention. This is the violence one. But on this proposed one that you're speaking to, that is the draft African Charter on Family Values and Sovereignty. I'm glad you've brought it up. It's essentially an anti-rights instrument. It was introduced at one of these conferences, these interparliamentary conferences, where they tabled this draft charter. And what it essentially, what it says it does is that it's aimed at protecting the family, but it's also aimed at protecting state sovereignty. And when they talk about state sovereignty, they're specifically talking about the state's sovereignty over education systems, over natural resources, over health, and over education. So if you just read it fleetingly, you might think it might be a good thing. You might think it's something that could be a good document, but it really, really isn't. And it's a draft document. It is circulating at these conferences, as I mentioned, but at ISLA, we're actually going to be having a webinar on this charter. It's going to be on Wednesday, the 12th of March, where we're going to be analyzing in greater detail what the legal implications of this convention are. But just to give you a bit of a snippet or a teaser about what our preliminary view on this charter is, this is actually a charter that is aimed at creating an alternative to a lot of the human rights obligations that already exist in the African regional human rights system. It's not just an alternative, it's opposed to a lot of the human rights obligations that currently exist. It's meant to rival them as well. So it's something that we are very concerned about, and we are still trying to fully grapple with its legal implications, which we'll be doing, as I said, at our webinar. But what I can say presently is that this draft charter is aimed at undermining the human rights obligations that even come from the Maputo Protocol. You might recall that the Maputo Protocol has very progressive provisions on sexual and reproductive health, entrenching even the right to abortion in certain circumstances. But what this convention or this charter, draft charter, if it even makes it through the AU system and becomes something that is binding, what it's threatening to do is to allow states an out from some of these obligations, or potentially allow them an out. So yes, we will be discussing that in more detail. Another concerning thing is it's aimed at creating almost like a treaty monitoring body that is going to be responsible for monitoring state compliance with this draft charter, but also interpreting the provisions of the charter, which stands in distinction from other human rights treaty monitoring bodies in the African regional human rights system, like the African Commission, the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. So it's almost like this alternative accountability body that they've created for themselves using these gutted human rights frameworks that are devoid of any normative content. So it's like they've created this forum with their own human rights instruments to hold themselves accountable to something that is opposed to what we understand are human rights norms and standards. Very, very concerning, but I will share the link to the webinar.
I mean, really scary, right? Like we're in very scary times.
Yeah.
That there's so many contradictions and such legislation that's being put up. Um, but to maybe try keep it positive. I mean, what are some of the success stories that you have? And again, we need to fight against these things. And like you've mentioned, there's various strategies, there's various measures that your organizations and others are taking. But I think, what are some of the success stories that I think can help inspire hope as to how we can challenge this moving forward?
One of the successes, I would believe, on resisting and holding the line on women's rights more generally is this campaign that we've started on the AU Convention on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. And what we did when we first saw the convention is we took a step back and we decided to analyze it in law, and we brought together a broad range of feminists, lawyers, researchers who work on violence against women, and we conducted a line-by-line analysis of the convention to ascertain to what extent it is aimed at improving women's lived realities. So we then conducted a legal analysis, and then we basically built a campaign called the hashtag Pause for Purpose campaign. And we've rallied together a number of different women, people, organizations that essentially have said that they want human rights protections that are meaningful, that are capable of changing women's lived realities. So I believe that's one of the positive examples of what coming together and standing together in solidarity can achieve if we are vigilant about these human rights protections, and if we seek to protect them, we can use the law as I've said before.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty positive sort of action plan. And it's not just one about sort of the very, very negative stories that we are hearing. I think the last question I would like to ask, which we have asked many of our guests before, is what is one question in your career/field you wish you could be asked but haven't or rarely get asked? Just take a stab.
It's a
Just
tough
take a
one,
stab
yeah.
at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really, really tough.
Mm.
I think a question that I think is worth asking to women and to people in their field is it worth it? Are you making any progress? Is there a meaningful impact? And I can honestly say that I'm always so grateful to be part of the feminist women human rights movement, because it is creating hope in my own life. It is showing me that I have an active role in making sure that the world is a better place for women, but it will be a better place for women even after me as well. So that would be a question that I would like people to ask and to even ponder on a daily basis. Is it worth it?
Yeah, no, that's incredible. That's absolutely an incredible thing to actually ponder on. That could be an episode in itself.
Sometimes I
So
don't think it's worth it, but
yeah, I don't know,
sometimes.
Maram, do you have something to say and on top of that, or?
No, I think it's tough work. And she's put it like spot on. It's not easy work. Sometimes there's a lot of challenges. Sometimes I think you start to become a little bit paranoid, especially working in fields that are so like male centered and male dominated. Where you think to yourself, "Oh, am I constantly being prejudiced or kind of marginalized because of my gender?" But then I think at other times you just need to really understand that these are our struggles and this is the value add that we bring, and that if we weren't here, I think it would be doing a disservice not only to us but to society at large. I mean, I think of the field that I'm in, and if we weren't present, I think that would have such a negative impact. So it is a struggle, but I think that, human rights generally it's a struggle. It's a struggle approach that you have to take. And it's tough work, but it's also worth it. Also, not to be too symbolic or sentimental, but it's really for the generations that also we leave behind, and we do it with that thinking in mind as well. So for International Women's Day, I think we need to keep the fight going.
Yeah, I think Sibusisiwe has given the question and Maram has given the answer. She's just said it's worth it. And she just basically said it's worth it. And basically the struggle is in zigs and zags, but it will sort of progress ultimately. And I think that's a perfect way to end this episode. You talked about women being present and failure to which would be negative, which is why we are asking for more women to be on our podcast. We have tried so many times, and we're so happy to have you guys on for this International Women's Day. We've had Sibusisiwe, Ndlela, and Maram Mahdi, who has been co-piloting this episode. So thank you for watching A4D and Africa for Dummies podcast, where we try to make everything make sense in this complex continent of Africa. Thank you very much.